Tough Topics, Kutztown University Radio's monthly community interest radio magazine, discussing issues few other shows are discussing. Addressing women's and LGBTQ+ issues, Tough Topics takes a deep look into issues that affect our lives. And now, from the Kutztown University Radio studios, your host of Tough Topics, Trisha.
Welcome to Tough Topics. You're listening to this on KUR, and I'm your host, Trisha. And today's topic is going to be looking at the Equal Rights Amendment and some abortion. Because if you're not aware, March is Women's History Month. So this is a really good topic to have for this month. And then today with me, I have Dr. Colleen Clements, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
It's nice to be with you, Trisha, as always. How many years has it been since you were in my class? Is that 5 years now?
That was my junior year, I think. So it was either my junior, or no, maybe it was my senior.
Might have been. Okay. It's just nice. It's nice to get to chat with students and watch you all grow. Mm-hmm. This is my 10th year at Kutztown. I am a professor of English. I have been the director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies for the past 5 years. And I am happy to talk about these things that continually require conversation, though it is frustrating to me that they do.
Absolutely. When I was reflecting this morning about how I was going to even introduce the Equal Rights Amendment, and actually throughout the show, we're going to kind of refer that to as the ERA, because it's a little bit easier to just say that. I don't know, when the topic itself was suggested, it didn't like spark joy. Like, I didn't get like super excited to like look into it and like talk about it and have that conversation. But then like just a moment ago, we kind of were like, we need to talk about it. Like, I don't know. We don't hear people talking about it often. So I think that's like a thing in itself, ultimately.
Yeah, what we need to remember is that it's funny how I argue that we're in a fourth wave of feminism, but to second wave feminists, the ERA was the thing. It was the thing. It inspired all the joy and all the passion. It is where all the energy and attention and effort went. So I'm sure Gloria Steinem would roll over in her New York Manhattan condo to hear that people don't really know about it. And as a professor of, and a scholar of these issues, I don't teach about it. I don't think about it often. I am ambivalent about it at best, but I also know why it's really important and why people should know what it is. They should know a little of the history of it, and they should keep an ear to the ground about it, because it does matter. It really does matter in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Prior to the show, I did some research on it because I don't think I was like very well versed in its history and like what it looks like. And so I'll get to the one point that I had made to you a little bit earlier before we started the show. For anyone that's not aware of what the ERA, it is it's a proposed constitutional amendment, and that's an important distinction that I'll get to in a second. It was originally proposed in 1923 by the National Women's Political Party. And it was passed on March 22nd of 1972 in the Senate and was sent to the states for ratification. So we're about a year short of the 50th anniversary of that happening. If anyone's not familiar with like how a constitutional amendment actually becomes an actual amendment of the Constitution, you need 23 states to ratify the amendment.
Is that right? That sounds very low.
23. Or maybe
I think it's 30.
Oh, 38. I'm silly.
Yeah.
Sorry, not whatever number.
I was like, woo! 3. We got 23.
The requirement of 38 states to ratify a proposed amendment, and unfortunately, the ERA didn't meet that.
It's right on the edge.
Yeah, we're like 3 states short.
I think
3
it might
states
be
short.
one. I think it might be one now, like Virginia.
Just one?
One. I really do think the last time I look, again, I don't pay. The last time I looked, I was like, this could actually happen and no one's paying attention. It was that close. I would have to look and see. Honest to God, I think it might be one, but we both should know this, right? Like, I should know this.
This is like the thing that we were talking about. Like, we're like, not.
And I don't, because it is to me so much about that second wave feminism that did discount so many people. But I think the ERA coming out of it could be positive. One thing that we need to remember is that women are the ones who ambushed the ERA. That this was taken down by mainly Phyllis Schlafly and her racist, very committed to biological essentialism group that wanted this to go down. They thought that the ERA pushed against what is quote unquote natural, that women should be in the home, that women don't need to have these rights. And so, you know, you've had class with me, we talk about how women can enact misogyny. Like, we have to remember that women worked against their own self-interests in order to make sure that the ERA, through fear, through drumming up absolute fear, ambushed it. And the reason it's not ratified, because it felt like a done deal in the early 70s, I would say. Like, it felt like a done deal. It had momentum. It made complete sense. And then as we see, things can get hijacked when suddenly, you know, sending out a white woman housewife who was very intelligent, deploying her as the voice against it to kind of warn other women is what undid the momentum of it. That's
definitely not something I saw when I was like looking at the history of it. And for anyone, I never finished like actually defining what the ERA was.
Well, that's also the problem, because we're trying to define. I mean, it might do, if you have the language, it might be good to just, it's like a sentence.
Yeah, from history.com, like the actual.
Yeah, why don't you read the actual language of the amendment? Because I think that would help the listeners.
Yeah, it says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So what?
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. And like, that's it. And
the argument against it was, well, we don't need this. That our Constitution has this. And what that is not acknowledging is that not everybody sees the Constitution as a living, breathing document that evolves with our humanity. And that there are plenty of people who read that document and it pertains to a very specific population, which is white men who look like the quote unquote founders of the United States. And so it creates all this space. We're seeing actually right now in Congress, a debate over a bill of, I mean, we just keep having to have debates about who is protected because this amendment doesn't exist. Now, I get a little nervous when I see the word sex, because that can be a really complicated term. It's rooted in biology, right? What does this mean? Would this amendment still discount trans folk? Like, so that's why I'm so ambivalent about it, because sometimes I think, is this worth the attention and energy when there are all these other pressing issues? But in fact, like if this amendment were added, it's kind of like Roe that we'll talk about later, creates like a federal wall. Like, it creates something that gives judges and, well, mainly judges and legislators. It gives them something a foundation. Like, it gives them a thing to say, no, you can't do this because the Constitution says. So we can have all the Supreme Court rulings and all these things, but as we see, if we don't have the ERA, and I'm clearly arguing for it, but I've done nothing to make it happen and probably never will. And like, this is not my cause. You know, if we don't have that, with different administrations, these folks who are in these margins, their lives get upended. And so I'm not sure how people read sex. That is my worry about That's what I always come back to with this amendment, because what that meant when it was written is very different than what it means now.
Absolutely. And actually that sparked more of an idea of maybe like, that's what we needed back in 1923 and early into like
mid 70s when it
yes, like we needed that language then, but now we need something that is more tailored to what life looks like now for women of color, trans women, and things like that. So I feel like it wouldn't even be a bad idea to think about amending the amendment, like rewriting it.
Then you start over.
Yeah.
That's the thing, right? It's like, so you run this marathon and you're a mile from the end. Do you finish the marathon knowing it's not the best thing, but it's better than nothing, and then start a new marathon? Or do you just throw this one out and then start over in a much more rabid political climate? I mean, there is no way this would pass some of the states that it has passed. So that's the big question. I mean, I think this is a big question in all movements to undo oppression, right? Like, is it fast enough? No. How do we do this? Do we do it through reform? Do we do it through revolution? Do we, I think it would be a Band-Aid in many ways. And I know people would find a way to get around it, but it would at least make sure that women are mentioned. Women are not, the word woman is not used in the Constitution. So this is the argument of the ERA. And that is a valid argument, I think, to put, I just hate the word sex. I hate that word. I hate when people use it. My hackles go up and I'm like, oh, nobody knows what that word actually means. So that's where I get stuck. I think it would be a Band-Aid. I don't think it would be a terrible Band-Aid, but I think it would maybe at least stop some of the bleeding that we see happening around us when administrations change.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's like the generic brand of Band-Aid. Like,
yeah,
it like will work for like a couple of hours or like a little bit, and then it like starts to fall off as soon as it gets slightly like wet.
Oh yeah, the moment I'm sure there's 800 ways to get around this, just like there are 800 ways to get around Roe, and people will figure them out. Mm-hmm. But at least a judge can say, no, this is unconstitutional. Whereas right now they cannot say that about certain types of discrimination.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that this point reminds me of is when I was looking at the ERA and like looking at this history, I was like, it doesn't feel like anything's different. Like, it doesn't feel like women are more valued now than they were. No. I just was like, we are still like not worth protecting. Like, that's all I could take away from the fact that it was not actually amended, or like it wasn't added to the Constitution. Like, that was one of the most disappointing things that I felt like I walked away from, and that this point of like, they're going to find ways around it. And it's like, yes, because there are still people that walk around and think women are not valuable. They're not.
Or that they're less than, right? That they're less than, or they don't have agency, or they don't have the ability to make choices. The amendment is, if you think about how hard a woman has to work and the courage that is required to step up and say that she has been discriminated against, it is exhausting. It is a risk. It is something that I have sometimes chosen to do and sometimes just chosen not to do, because it's like, what good is going to come from this? Which is terrible. But like, a woman might feel a little more empowered, or a group of women might feel a little more empowered to step up and say, this is a real thing and I am protected by the Constitution from this. That to me is the primary reason that this would be valuable.
Absolutely.
Again, I'm not doing anything to fight for this. Like, I'm not writing to anybody. I'm pretty sure it's one state away. I think that state is Virginia. I'm not even really sure. but this is not like pressing. I know that Ms. has written about, I mean, I think people are working on this. It's just not my issue, right? And to me, it would be great if it happened, but I'm probably not doing much to make it happen other than maybe talking with you about it, getting it on people's radar, doing a little bit of research about it to understand it over the past few years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was about to ask, like, how, for people that are out there, like, how do you advocate for the ERA? Like, how do
you have to within the states? That's it. I mean, honestly, Pennsylvania ratified it. We're one of the states that ratified. I'm sure there's a list somewhere.
I'm trying to actually just start.
Maybe during the break, I'll quickly look to see the states. But I think I remember being like, well, Pennsylvania ratified it, so there's not really anything I can do.
Mm-hmm.
It's up to each individual state and their legislature. Mm-hmm. So I feel like unless you're in one of the states, the only thing you could do is support, some kind of advocacy group that's working on it. That's true. Because at this point, like, until whatever state or states are left to ratify it, like, if your state did it, like, then that's right. The face and the shrug that you're making is kind of just how I feel about the ERA all the time. Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, when I first looked, it was Christine that mentioned the ERA to me, and I was like, I was thinking about it, and I was like, this doesn't like spark joy. Like, I'm like, this seems, I think if I had to use a word, it would have been like, this seems boring. Well, it's not very big, right? It's like a sentence. Yeah, no, it's not a big one. But I think one of the things that I was, hearing in the podcast that you had recommended, Ordinarily Equal. So let's do a little shout out. That was very helpful to me. So you should plug that for sure. Yes. If you're interested in learning a lot more about the ERA and even like how it connects to abortion, there is a podcast. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. It's called Ordinarily Equal. And there's 2 seasons so far. And the first season is all about the ERA. So Pennsylvania did ratify it in 1972, and Virginia ratified it on January 15th, 2020. I think which is when I got on my radar. That makes sense. That's when I started paying attention, when that came up in the news, and I was like, what? It did. Now that vote pushed it to the 3/4 of states for ratification, but that doesn't mean anything happened. And so I didn't look into, like, in limbo. Everything about the ERA and women really is in limbo. It's like at the hands of somebody else, which is exactly the state of gender in the United States and the world. Let's take a break, and I think when we come back from the break, we'll get more into abortion, Roe versus Wade, how like the ERA kind of connects to this, but you're listening to Tough Topics on KUR with your host Trisha, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR. I'm your host Trisha, and I have with me Dr. Colleen Clemens, and for anyone that may just be tuning in now, we just wrapped up a kind of big conversation about the Equal Rights Amendment as a still proposed amendment to the Constitution. It is not fully ratified and amended in the Constitution. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on abortion, Roe versus Wade. And that was this topic was sparked through the fact that one of the consequences to not having the ERA as an actual constitutional amendment is it then puts the responsibility in the state's hands and not so much the federal government. And we see that being an issue because then you don't see uniform laws and regulations on things. And this was sparked by one of the episodes that I mentioned earlier from Ordinarily Equal about female genital mutilation and how not all states have laws against that. So, yeah, and abortion is a state-by-state thing. So this is
one of the things that Dr. Clemens is very, very knowledgeable about. So.
Well, right. If there were one big umbrella that your episode today is about, is federal, right? Why do federal regulations matter in the United States? And it is because it gives a foundation for the judiciary and the legislators to have when they make these decisions. So, just like with the ERA, Roe does exist. It's not an amendment, but it was one of several, the most pronounced abortion reproductive rights ruling out of the Supreme Court. And it is that firewall. It is the firewall that the ERA would create. It is the foundation that the ERA would create so that a judge can say, this violates Roe v. Wade, right? Or this violates the Equal Rights Amendment. It gives some teeth to those rights. Now, then you brought up states. And that states is, to me, what states are doing to reproductive rights is where we need to pay attention, because state by state is having different, not all states, hashtag not all states, not all states, but a lot of states are trying to undo Roe, chip away at Roe from all the angles. So we talked about that with the ERA, right? The moment it gets passed, the people will figure out ways around it, but at least it's there. So that is exactly what has been happening since Roe. And I know I gave a talk for the Women's Center last semester about, does Roe still matter? And my argument was yes, it absolutely matters. Like, it cannot be overturned, but that you can't put all your energy and attention into having that conversation and then ignore what is happening in states. Like just a few weeks ago, South Carolina, I mean, the names of these bills make me want to gag. The governor signed the South Carolina Fetal Heartbeat and Protection from Abortion Act. And a judge was able to put a stay on that and say, nope, this cannot be enacted. Just because you signed it doesn't mean that it's constitutional. The judge used the argument that there are women who are already have appointments for abortions, and the law was supposed to go into effect that day. And so she was able to say, this violates Roe, right? That's what gives her the power. If Roe didn't exist and this hadn't been decided by the federal courts, she would not have she could have still done that, but it's going to go, the point of what all these states are doing is they're trying to get something in front of the Supreme Court. For 1 second, do not think that that's not what they're trying to do. And they see a Supreme Court that is now amenable and open to dismantling Roe. Not undoing it, because overturning it would be pointless. And people would understand that. It's not going to be that overt. It's going to be some new ruling, perhaps a personhood bill, and that's what's going to happen. So Roe's not going to go away. I don't think anybody's going to overturn Roe, because people understand that would be bad. What will happen is there will be one of these cases that'll go through the entire federal court system, land in front of those judges, which is deeply problematic when one president was able to appoint 3 people. And that's what they're doing. That's exactly what this state and all the other states that are putting these ridiculous bills out, that's what they're trying to do. And you see how they're doing that? They're using the courts, right? This is why things like the ERA and Roe matter. They know that those laws matter. They wouldn't be trying to do this if those laws didn't matter. There wouldn't be people arguing against the ERA if it didn't matter. So often, states' rights collide with federal, right? We live in the United States. We see this all the time. What rights do the states have? What rights do we have as American citizens?
I'm like just digesting all of that, because there was a lot
I
of
can tell you a little more about this, Bill, if you would like. I mean, it's, you know, the thing is that if a woman goes for an abortion, she will be forced to have an ultrasound. If the doctor detects a heartbeat, then she cannot get an abortion, unless, of course, and you can probably guess this, if her pregnancy was caused by rape or incest, or the mother's life is in danger. And this little disclaimer that is always added is really frustrating to me, because this focus on victimhood should signal to people how people who try to enact this legislation do not believe that women have agency. That the only way you can make a decision about this thing happening to in your own body is the only way you can get what you want is if you were a victim. And our love in the United States of women and victimhood is upholding, you know, because it's like an out. Well, if she was raped or if it was incest, P.S., let's talk about how long it takes to prove those things. Way longer than it's legal for her to get an abortion. And also, how is she going to prove that? How is she going to prove that in time? Because we know we live in a country that doesn't listen to women when they say they have been, you know, they're survivors of rape or survivors of incest. We don't believe women. So, like, is there just like a little box there that says, yes, I was raped? Like, do you have to claim victimhood? And then also you won't be believed anyway? Like, to me, this immediately shows the triple bind that women are just forced into. So it's got that frustrating little caveat. And let's all remember, lots of women don't know they're pregnant before there is a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that is hard. To think about a heartbeat is hard. And I've been very open with this when I talk about abortion. I went through a lot to have my daughter. When I finally saw a heartbeat, I was really happy. And I've been in a room where the heartbeat was gone, and I was really sad. Like, I'm not incapable of understanding, but that's my life and my body. So just because that's my experience doesn't mean that translates to all the other women. Like, I can say, yep, that's still a zygote, right? That's still a fetus. Like, it's not a person. And there is a person sitting there in front of you that you're ultrasounding, that you are completely ignoring because of this fingernail. Like, I don't want to devalue that, because I know this is a complicated topic and it's complicated for me. But I can sit here and say, you should still get to have an abortion just because you didn't know you were pregnant.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I feel like those bills, and there will always be future bills that are going to be proposed to regulate women's bodies.
Always.
And there's always going to be those stupid disclaimers of like, okay, you can have an abortion if you like were violated in XYZ way. And that kind of to make the point of what you were saying earlier, that they know what to say to get as many people on board with that kind of regulation. They know if they say something like that, that like silences or quiets down anyone that might be like, well, what if she was raped? Mm-hmm. There's always one. There's always at least one.
As if that's some heroic stance, right? Well, I mean, really, if she's raped, then she should be able to have that abortion. You know, like, that's it. So a medical procedure. You're deciding that I need to be a victim in order to have a medical procedure.
Mm-hmm. Instead of like actually asking the bigger questions of like, okay, so what are we doing about that rape? Like, how are we holding that person accountable? Yeah. How are we like fixing that problem to avoid possibly having to get an abortion?
Oh, we don't care about that. This country does not care about structural change and structural solutions. Let's be very upfront about this. that this law would force a person who may have been raped to then be ultrasounded, which is very violating. Yeah, right? I had to do it all the time. Again, trying to have my daughter. It's not pleasant. Like, so now you're going to like re-traumatize a person. And now you're going to like force this person to make the argument based on victimhood that they need a medical procedure. This is a medical procedure. Mm-hmm. This is not, I mean, like everybody with their like late term abortion, like those don't happen. They don't happen. If they happen, it is a terrible situation for everyone who is involved. This is this idea that women can't make their, you use the verb have, that women can have an abortion. It's like asking for dessert. Can I have dessert? Right? Like it was so interesting that you use that verb, that they let women have. I know I can't curse, so I'm not going to, but I want everybody listening to think about how ridiculous that is. Mm-hmm. Can I have can I have my appendix removed? Please. Can I have my tonsils out?
Please.
Can I have LASIK surgery? All of these things are more invasive than most abortions. And we could even make them less invasive if we had more access to Plan B. If we had, more access to reproductive education. Like, again, the structural changes are of no interest to people legislating bills like this. They are interested when the one moment where the rubber hits the road, where a woman is sitting there in stirrups being forced to have an ultrasound, some states forcing her to look at the screen. I'm not sure what South Carolina's rule is. Being forced to listen to a heartbeat may be the first moment where this woman realizes that she's pregnant. That's what they're interested in, that one moment, that individual moment, and then they get to decide how to arbitrate it. Mm-hmm. Any discussion of structure is not happening. They don't care. They literally do not care about structural change. They don't.
For anyone that might not know, because I think media does a bad job at kind of indicating or representing things correctly. When you're in very, very, very early stages of pregnancy, your ultrasound is not external. It's not the thing that you see in movies of them.
No. It's wanding. I called it wanding.
It's a wand, and they do it internally. So they insert it into your vagina and take it that way. So when Dr. Clemens is mentioning, like, if you were sexually assaulted or you were raped, that is re-traumatization. Like, that's not good.
No, and let's all remember what that person has had to go through to get into those stirrups. They may have had to drive more than a day's worth. They may have had to find some kind of accommodation because of waiting periods. They may have crossed state lines because they had no options. They may have had to come up with money to pay for this abortion because funding is not, things like that. I think it's the Hyde Amendment. Something disallows state or government funds to pay for abortions. So there's all these things that this woman has gone through already, maybe just to be in that doctor's office. And so what's interesting about this law in South Carolina, I feel like this is whack-a-mole. Every time I have this conversation with Kutztown, there's some new law I have to talk about, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And this fight is never going to end, which is why Roe can never go away. But this law, there's no charge for the woman. Okay, so there's no punishment other than the fact she can't get an abortion. But the abortion provider can be fined $10,000, and I don't know if there's, and could be charged with a felony and sentenced up to 2 years. So this law goes after the providers. So they're trying to cut abortion off at the source because it's already risky. I came of my feminist age in the 90s when people were literally killing abortion doctors outside of clinics. That's not a culture that's anymore, but that was, in the 90s when I was kind of learning about this, that's what was happening. So they're always trying to cut it off at the source, right? And people don't become abortion providers. It's too controversial. It's constantly changing. It is unsafe. Now this, right, in South Carolina. And I want to remind everybody that this is all a conversation about legal abortion, and illegal abortion will continue to happen. Abortions will continue to happen. We're just talking about what's legal or not. Women have had abortions. They will continue to have abortions. This is not going to magically make abortion go away. You're just making it harder and forcing poor women, usually, poor women to have children they don't want to have. Listen, I say this every time I talk about this. I am a wealthy white lady. If my daughter needs an abortion, I'll find her one, even if it's illegal. That's how these things work, right? These like kind of underground operations, which is what Roe was trying to undo, because sometimes those would be shady and women would die. So this is basically saying we're cool with women dying, trying to have access to their own reproductive rights. We're totally fine with that, because this thing with a flickering fingernail heartbeat is inside of her. That's what's being said when laws like this continue. I'm not joking. It is constant. If you start paying attention to this, dear listener, you will be exhausted, because it is constant. States are constantly doing this, and you have to stay focused. You have to keep paying attention, because Roe can only uphold so much chicanery. I would use a different word if we're not on the radio, but I'll say chicanery.
I want to go back a little bit to, well, first let me just, people don't give an F about women. And
I do.
I know. The general.
You didn't need to have a daughter to do that. You know, I hate that. Oh, just think, what if you have a sister, you have a mother? I'm like, you shouldn't have to have any of those things to care about women. Let's be very clear. Some people do, but structurally, people do not care.
No.
We are expendable. Let's be very clear. Women's bodies are expendable, especially Black women's bodies. Like, these are commodities in our worlds. And the fact that you think that somebody should carry a baby to term because you think it's okay is the perfect example of that.
Yeah. I want to go back to the point of, like, when you were like, and that doesn't even take into consideration the things that she would have had to do to get into that kind of an appointment. And that really speaks to that while they're legal in some states, they're not always accessible.
All states must have access to abortion. Okay, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's part of the law. So every state must have access. So we'll complicate that in a second. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I couldn't think of the word when I was like typing up these notes. So like, I don't know what the word is for the fact that, like, I don't think it was equity. I don't think that's the word I want.
Are you talking about how states erode? I mean, that women don't have an equitable access. Women do not have equitable access to reproductive medicine in this country.
I think that's what I was thinking of. Like, the fact that it's like, yes, I can go get an abortion. I can do that. That can be a choice I have. But where to, like, I don't even know where to go.
DC has more abortion providers than the state of Mississippi. You know, that kind of thing. They have to have one, but that doesn't mean it needs to be easy to get to or easy to access. And if you are a woman who doesn't have a lot of money and has to stay overnight because of a waiting period, or is forced to be traumatized again because of an ultrasound, like, the chipping away, that to me, that's what I imagine. Like, Roe is like this really strong statue, and the just constant chipping away at it, and it'll always be there. It might just be the pillar, the pedestal, but it has to be there, because if it's not, if Roe didn't exist, like, this guy could have just made this law, and anybody that was supposed to have an abortion, like, the next day would be SOL. And so thank God, you know, a judge can say, nope, you're violating this law. And there's more beyond Roe. Roe, I think, is just the most prominent because it was the first. And around the same time as the ERA, you know, if we want to bring this back full circle, that the ERA coming to the forefront during second wave feminism is right around the same time as Roe. So, you know, Roe was a big win, right? And then the ERA was a big loss. And that's a good reminder that how these movements work. It's wins and it's losses. And you just figure out how to maintain the wins, and you figure out how to move forward with the losses. That undoing oppression is not easy. I get frustrated as an older person, you know, because I'm like, wow, we've made so much progress. Like what I have seen in 25 years of teaching is incredible. And I get that people want to like discount that things aren't as good as they can be. And I agree they aren't as good as they can be. But boy, I can say that things are better than they were for like my LGBT students in 1996 who would like come out to me and couldn't even talk to their parents. You know, things are better. They're not the best, but they're better. And Roe makes things better for women. The ERA would probably make things better for women. And so maybe I should reinvigorate my interest in the ERA and pay more attention to it. I just feel like there's other things for me that I want. Abortion, for example, you know, I pay a lot more attention to those things.
I think that's also like the fact of like, if a state ratified it, like there is not much else you can do. But with Roe, you know, there is so much work to be done. Always.
There's constantly things you can do. One thing you can do is pay attention. One thing you can do is support abortion providers like Planned Parenthood, Keystone Planned Parenthood specifically in Pennsylvania. You can have conversations with people about why this matters. You can have conversations with people about how women should have access to abortion, even if they haven't been victims. And you can remind people that they know somebody that had an abortion. They might not know it, but they know people that have had abortions. That abortion is not, it is healthcare. Like it is health care. And I understand that it's complicated healthcare. But
sorry, go ahead.
No, it's healthcare. the end.
That's okay. I always like to throw this out there. And your point of saying that like, there's people out there that get abortions. Like there are people that will say something like, well, I don't know anyone. I don't know any women that have had an abortion. And I always like to throw out there, if you don't know anyone, or at least one person that has had an abortion, then you are most likely saying something or doing something that reads to them that they cannot trust you to tell you that information.
And you could just send them to shout, you know, hashtag shout your abortion, and you can just read all about all these other women that have had an abortion. And you're right. I mean, and it's just not something people talk about. It's a stigma that I haven't had an abortion. I have not had that experience. I have had many experiences, you know, in that realm, but not that. And I feel like even, I don't know if I would be like shouting my abortion like Lindy West, or I don't know. I don't know what that experience is like. And so I want people to hear, like, you don't have to tell anybody about your abortion, right? That is not on people that have had an abortion. But if people, I mean, if somebody said to me, I don't know anybody that has had an abortion, I will tell them you do. You absolutely do. They just haven't told you, like you said. Like, there's no way statistically you don't know somebody that hasn't had an abortion, unless you don't know anybody. Like, maybe you don't know people, and people don't realize, like, people who have abortions they're people who have already had children. They are people who understand what that means. This is not like every 18-year-old, like oversexed 18-year-old who's just out randomly having sex, which, by the way, if that's what you're doing, fine. And if you need to have an abortion because of that, fine. You don't have to have some kind of code of morality for me to say an abortion is fine for you. But I think that's what people think of. And they don't think of like a mother of two who's like got pregnant and is like, I can't have another child. I cannot afford this child. I cannot care for this child. Mm-hmm. You know, I think people have in their mind one vision of who gets an abortion, and they need to really open up their view, their vision of who is having that kind of healthcare.
Absolutely. And social media, while it has its really big downsides, has its upsides. I've seen a lot of women come out with their stories about how they're like, yeah, I am a mother of like 3, and like I was going to die if I kept this child. I was going to, or this child was not going to live very long after I gave birth to it. And those are hard decisions to make.
Yeah. And they're decisions that a woman and any other party that's privy to that story should be able to make.
And I think
without some, I mean, I can't tell you how tired I am of looking at pictures of these white dudes making decisions about women's bodies. I really can't take it any much longer, because it is these people who literally have no skin in the game continually making decisions about what women can do in regard to their own bodies and families. It is obscene. I hope more people are starting to see this as absolutely obscene.
I hear that. And one last like takeaway is, if you know that when a woman has to make that kind of decision, it's not easy. Nope. No one's ever running to like get these abortions and being like, wee, like this is a good time. These are hard decisions that
women are capable of making.
Yes.
That women are capable of making, and should not be made by somebody behind a desk signing a bill, or somebody behind an ultrasound wand, or somebody behind even a judicial bench. This is a decision women are capable of making. And even if you don't like that decision, she gets to make it.
On that note, also know that women are just capable, and they are valuable.
Yes, exactly.
They're worth all the things, and we are strong, and we are just as great as a man, as anyone that views as opposite or less than.
And when the structures around us support that, I will be thrilled. And that is, I always joke, I'm like, I could use a little less job security with this. Like, if these problems could just go away and my job would disappear, I would be the happiest person of anybody, because I don't enjoy talking about this stuff all day long. But I know that if somebody isn't, if we let down our guard for a minute, somebody is going to use that opportunity to push in and create some new legislation that is going to undo exactly what you just said about women.
Yeah. Yep. Well, Dr. Clemens, I really appreciate you joining today, and I appreciate sharing your story and your experience, even just with your daughter and what that journey looked like. I always have a hard time with personal anecdotes, partly because I don't think people should have to put their heart out there and be like, this was my experience, for people to care.
I know that people rely on pathos, though. You know, the writing professor in me knows that people will not listen if you don't have some pathos, if you don't have a way to connect and be with the person on the other side, especially if they don't agree. So I think I'm willing to do that, and have been very open about how I'm connected to this discussion. But, you know, I don't want people to feel like they have to be, ever.
I hear that. Well, thank you again for joining. I'm just going to do some last minute event plugging for the rest of the semester for what we got going on here at the Women's Center.
We're Women's History Month. And if you're one of those people saying, why do we need Women's History Month? Again, I would love Women's History Month to go away. So when structurally women's history is just part of history, that'll be great. But until then, that's why we have Women's History Month.
Absolutely. I'm just looking up some. So yeah, for the Women's Center, what we got going on for the month of March, because it is Women's History Month, is today was a Feminist Friday. So if you missed that, or if me talking about it right now is something that you're like, oh, what is that? There will be more in the future. There will be 2 more actually that happen in April. So definitely keep an eye out on our social media for that. We also have International Women's Day happening on Wednesday, March 31st. The theme is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. And that specifically will also look at self-care around the world as well, and how women are taking care of themselves, or just generally how people are taking care of themselves. From 11 to 2 in Old Main 126, we'll celebrate womanhood and self-care around the globe. Stop in the Women's Center to learn and pick up a self-care bag. And they include a lot of different goodies. Women's Empowerment Day is on the 30th, so the day before actually International Women's Day. It's on Tuesday from 7 to 9. We're hoping to have, we're going to collab with the Multicultural Center, and we're going to have an evening of poetry and empowering activities. Hint, hint, there might be a bonfire. We're still waiting on some approval for that. Keep an eye out. If you want more updates on our events that are happening, feel free to follow us on social media. We have our Instagram account. It's Women's Center KU. We're on Facebook as well. So yeah, that's the best way to keep updated with all the stuff that's going on. But thank you for listening to Tough Topics. I am your host, Trisha, on KUR.